Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Dan Borshire, coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people. Coming up, polls open for the Indigenous voice referendum as both sides call out threats of violence. Renewed calls for pill testing as two young men die at a Sydney music festival. And footy nail biters, 3 grand finals go down to the wire to test fans' hearts. Joining me on the panel tonight, national reporter at the Australian Financial Review, Samantha Hutchinson. Welcome back. Good to have you along.
Good to be here.
Senior Counsel at PremierNational and former Liberal MP Fiona. Good to talk to you again.
Nice to see you, Dan.
In Brisbane, author, non-profit chair, former ambassador and Labor Party member Ian Kemish. Welcome back to the show.
Great to be with you, Dan.
And in Cairns, chair and co-founder of Deadly Inspiring Youth Doing Good, Semara Jose. Wonderful to have you here.
So good to be back. Which way?
You can join us online using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we live stream on Facebook as well. Well, first to the housing market tonight, and while millions of Australians may be struggling to pay the rent from month to month, homeowners are winning from a seemingly never-ending wave of property price rises thanks to strong demand and limited supply of housing. New data from CoreLogic shows national property prices for both standalone houses and units rose 0.8% in September, led by gains in Adelaide, Brisbane and Perth. It means that despite a big hike in interest rates, prices have now risen for 8 consecutive months. National property prices are now 6.6% higher than the low of January and are now back near record highs.
Highest growth has been found across Adelaide, which was up a remarkable 1.7% in the month of September. This was followed by a 1.3% result across Brisbane and Perth. And these 3 markets are generally where supply levels remain very low. Meanwhile, we've seen a fall in Hobart. It's the only city that's maintained a decline this month, and it comes off the back of a more extended decline where values have fallen about 16 of the past 18 months.
Samantha, what's at play here? Can you give us a sense of some of the factors that are going into what we're seeing there in the housing market?
Well, I mean, we've come out of COVID. We've seen an opening of the international borders. So we're seeing, a level of migration that was put on hold for about 2 years. But the biggest issue is that we've got no housing supply at the moment. We've got Anthony Albanese, who's come in, who knows that this is a huge, huge issue. You've got the Minns government in New South Wales as well, which is really committed to alleviating this problem of housing supply. The problem is, though, we've got a lot of cash being thrown at the problem, but we're not really hearing enough about the critical issue, which is planning. So we've still got a planning system which is caught up in all of the local councils, where you've got councillors and a planning system and planners who don't have much interest in actually boosting density in the areas that they're responsible for at the moment.
And when that planning issue, I suspect, comes up and is more important or less important depending on which jurisdictions.
Yep.
The others around supply are also like that. Are there other factors that are more at play in say, Hobart and Tasmania than they are in Queensland or Western Australia?
I think still the biggest issue and the biggest constraint that we're seeing is still in the capital cities like Sydney, where the median's now over 1.1 million for a house. In South Australia, it's up around $700,000. In Victoria, it's still up around $760,000 at the moment. And the reality is things just aren't getting built fast enough. There's the political appetite to build, but the question of actually getting shovels in the ground is completely different. And this is where you're running into the argument about areas which don't, in theory, they want more housing. They'd like to see their housing become more affordable, but actually putting up with more people in the area or perhaps losing your view, that becomes a much more vexed issue.
Now, while all this is happening, of course, the Reserve Bank is meeting tomorrow. This will be the first meeting with Michelle Bullock as Governor. I'm not going to ask you for a prediction unless you want to give one, but what are you expecting that discussion to be tomorrow?
So, I mean, I would say for Michelle Bullock's first meeting as Governor of the RBA, it would take a lot of appetite to lift rates at the moment. I mean, the average household, which is paying a mortgage at 4.1 when you've got a cash rate, close to 4.5%, it would take a lot of political appetite to lift them again. Also, when you've got an outlook at the moment where we're expecting household spending to keep on coming in towards the end of the year, we are seeing some mitigating factors that means that inflation won't rise as high. But you've got the cost of living at the moment. And sorry, it's a bit of a roundabout answer, but I don't think that there's much appetite to lift interest rates at the moment.
Yeah. Fiona, these reports are indicating that all those factors are indicating that house prices are going to continue to rise. So what do you think that means for the broader picture around housing and housing affordability?
I think it's a big challenge. I think it's a challenge for young Australians to get into their first home because it's just skyrocketing. I mean, you're 100% right, Sam. I mean, when you look at trying to get into the housing market, the way the DA portals are working within councils, I mean, if you tried to build before COVID, a DA for a standard house, for a house and land package might take 3 weeks. There's some councils that they're saying at least 12 months. And that means that if you're going into a house and land package, for some people, it might be a 2 or 3 year project to get there, which means that the investment that it takes for people to build houses and to build that supply is catastrophic. In New South Wales, for instance, the state government, the former Liberal state government, put in the Parkland Authority that sat as another layer of bureaucracy that took longer to release housing and supply of land to build new houses. And of course, we have suburbs here like Redfern or Surrey Hills that, I'm sorry, your Georgian and Victorian terraces are beautiful, but they probably need to be 15 stories. And
this is at that point around density.
Correct, correct. So there's a whole range of issues that are very difficult to solve. And when you've got councillors and state MPs and federal MPs all colliding together, the political appetite to be able to, you know, put a wrecking ball through terraces in Redfern or bulldoze critically endangered habitat in Western Sydney, or whether that's in other outskirts of metropolitan Sydney, cities become very, very difficult. So what does it mean for families? It means young people are delaying starting a family, young people are staying at home longer. It means that elderly parents are being moved out of their own autonomy into housing with younger members of their family. We're seeing a compression of those things, and the former Governor Lowe, he was criticised at the time when he made that exact comment. Now, you look at the Minns government, they made a comment of 5,000 houses between now and 2049, whilst between now and 2041, New South Wales will see 1.7 million people come in. I mean, I want to go and get shares in Coleman tents or portable, modular homes, because where is all these people going to live? Like, this comes down to what will be the quality of life, the standard of living for every Australian. The Australia that we saw 30 years ago, where you could have a trampoline in the backyard and maybe a pool, is just going to be unattainable at this current rate unless governments find a way of working this issue through, from planning, through finance, through supply chains to build houses. It's very complex. And
navigating all of those complexities. Semara, I saw that you were nodding away there. What's your perspective on this housing situation?
Yeah, look, I totally agree that it's completely complex, and some things are out of my understanding, I guess, around how do we address and solve this stuff. But we know that the pressure is tight, and then even more so with young people. There's been young advocates from places like Arakoon, for example, Topsy Bowenda, who've often called for independent housing for young people to be built, independent, one-bedroom units in remote communities to give them sense of space and place. We've often talked about, as First Nations people, there's multiple layers on top of this with intergenerational wealth, a real challenge for our community. And so even the idea and the concept of buying a house and owning land, freehold land, is something really complex. In communities like Yarrabah, they only in the last 5 years have been able to have freehold land of their community. So the ability to buy in our place and in our communities has been extremely complex. I want to buy a house. I'd love to.
Yeah, how are you going? How are you going with that?
I live at home with my mum. So, the reality is that it's hard to be a single person with the idea of wanting to buy a house and to own property. But that's a challenge. I'm trying to save as much as I can and educate myself about how do we even do this and how do we how do we step into this property market when that's not necessarily a knowledge that my family has come from, you know. My auntie is one of our only siblings who has recently bought a house, and, you know, so there's a lot of these first time experiences that our families are going through that we're you know, sharing and learning and having to learn on the go.
So you're actually navigating all of these challenges that we're discussing right now, trying to figure this out. Is there a sense for you, Semara, of what would make it easier for you to get into that home that you want?
Make more money? I don't know. That would be awesome, but you know, to be honest, I don't really know. There's not a lot of houses out there that we can buy that are, you know, ready for us to just be able to walk into and at a reasonable price. So when I think about buying a house, I have to think about how will I actually live in that house, and, you know, how will I have to supplement my income to be able to do those things. So there are a lot more complexities rather than just the process of actually buying the house and, you know, getting a loan and doing all those things and pieces, but it's actually about supplementing my income and growing my own wealth. And yeah, that's a whole nother layer that is just complicated. Yeah,
it is certainly complex. Ian, there's another layer to this, isn't there? And that is that if you have been trying to get into a home, or the rents have risen too much, or mortgage repayments, and you've been pushed out, then it can be a very difficult place to navigate. Now, you're actually the chair of Third Space. This is a daytime drop-in centre that offers support for people experiencing or at risk of homelessness. Have you seen a change in who is coming to your services, or even the volume of people?
We sure have. Look, the pressures on young people particularly are extraordinary, and Semara's case just then, you know, a very compelling story. Across the country, we're seeing a complete change in the demographics of homelessness. First of all, we're seeing at one end of the spectrum people who actually have full-time jobs who can't afford to get a permanent roof over their heads. We're also seeing more families, more women finding themselves without a home and accessing services like Third Space. We're also seeing the numbers increase quite significantly. So last financial year, that is up until the end of June last year, we had typically up to about 120 people visiting Third Space every day, and that compares to about 100 the previous year. Can't say yet, but it's looking like we are going to be, you know, beating that record, if I can put it that way, in the coming year as well. So, you know, that's one little snippet, but this is happening across the country, and this is happening in a place where, you know, I live not so far from it, and the paradox of these inner urban areas in Brisbane and elsewhere is that they can be quite affluent markets where property is relatively expensive these days, these inner urban areas, and yet they're alongside these epicentres of homelessness.
And I suspect you're in a really unique position, Ian, to have a sense of what are some of the range of levers that need to be pulled to give that assistance to the people that are coming in greater volumes to your service.
Look, ultimately housing supply is all, but look, as we've just heard, you need a planning system to support the provision of housing supply. It can't happen miraculously. It'd be useful if we could harness the policy initiatives that are now underway, and there are some good initiatives underway at both the federal and state level across the country, harness those with a time machine, because the time to invest in housing supply was 20 years ago. We'd be much better off had we done that, had we planned. There's going to be a lag time. There's going to be a lag time between the announcement and realisation of all these initiatives that we're now, in an encouraging way, hearing about. And people are going to experience pain through that period.
Yeah, it's certainly challenging times. It's been a tragic start to the summer music festival season. Two men in their 20s collapsed at the knockout event in Western Sydney yesterday and sadly later died in hospital. Police say they're waiting for autopsies, but after dozens of drug-related arrests across 3 weekend events, they've warned of the deadly consequences of illicit drug use. It's restarted a debate today on pill testing, giving users on-site evaluation of a drug before they take it. It's common in Europe and on trial in Queensland and the ACT, but not in New South Wales ahead of a planned drug summit. Fiona Van Booker advised 4 Prime Ministers leading the National Council on Drugs and is now president of Harm Reduction Australia. He told the Drum rolling out more pill testing will save lives.
The evidence is quite clear in terms of what we've produced in Canberra, but also internationally. That pill testing occurs around the world, New Zealand, close by, and in Europe for a number of years, almost 20 years, I think, in Europe they've been operating. The stumbling block is really the politicians. The community support, our latest polling shows around 70% in New South Wales of people support pill testing being available. And to be honest, it probably reminds me a bit of the marriage equality debate a few years ago, where the public was way ahead of the politicians on this. Politicians like to say we're giving a green light to drug use in that same thing. Well, we're actually saying to people, they've run a gauntlet of sniffer dogs, police, security, brought the drugs into the festival. I think we can all agree they're pretty committed to consuming that substance they've brought through after they've gone through all of that. So what we say is, rather than a green light, pause. Just wait, come and talk to us, come and find out exactly what it is that you're about to consume and find out what it is, what impact that may have on you and your health. And what we find now is that probably 20%, more than 20% don't actually consume the drug. They discard the drug in our amnesty bin. Others say that they're going to be very careful and rethink about whether they'll take it. So that's the impact we have. There'll be alerts go out from government authorities saying, be careful, there's a synthetic drug on the market there's drugs that contaminated with a particular chemical molecular combination. And yet they can't see that what could actually inform the market better is pill testing or drug checking services. Imagine if you went to the supermarket and there were just no labels on anything to actually inform you what was in there, no star ratings, nothing, and you just had to guess from the look of it whether it was good for you, bad for you. That's what the unregulated drug market is at the moment. It's a completely uninformed consumer market, and that has huge impacts like we've seen this weekend. And if we can't bring ourselves to make change now, or to be held back by the promise of a drug summit sometime in the future, then we're not really looking after our own citizens, but we're not looking after our young people. For 5 years, we've been offering a free trial to New South Wales government at a festival of their choice with an evaluator of their choice. In the lead up to the summit, it makes sense to actually run the trial now, so that when the summit occurs and people are gathering there to discuss different policy options, they can have our data, they can have the evaluation information.
Semara, there's really 2 parts to this, isn't there? On the one hand, there's this tragic news of these 2 deaths, and then the conversation that it has sparked about pill testing. I wonder if you wanted to weigh in on both.
Oh, well, first and foremost, just our condolences to the families of these 2 young fellas. It's always hard to lose family to this and to a choice, but I'm all about harm reduction. I totally agree with the idea and the notion of giving free, drug testing, capabilities at festivals and roll it out, because we know from our conversations and our experiences that sadly drugs are readily available, and they make their way into these spaces where a lot of young people are experiencing and testing and trying new things. It's the age bracket, right? Every single young person is testing the boundaries and testing that space. And we have to do what we can within our power to be able to ensure that they're making informed decisions. At the end of the day, it's their choice whether or not they're going to consume that illicit drug, but we have to ensure that we can reduce that harm. We spend a lot of time in, having conversations with young people when we're mentoring and talking about individual choices. And those conversations are very much receptive. Young people want to have these conversations and understand what is in the things that they're consuming. But we need to be able to provide that service, and we need people to be readily available.
And when you talk about harm reduction, sometimes in this debate it can be linked that if you're a supporter of pill testing, that you're also supporting drug use. How do you feel about when that connection is made?
Look, I think they're two completely separate issues, right? Like, I don't condone drug use. It's not something I do. It's not something that, you know, I really strongly advise young people not to do, to make that choice for yourself in your own body. But I also acknowledge that there are people out there that are going to do this stuff either way. So the best way that we can support those individuals who are choosing to engage in illicit drugs is to ensure that they are safe doing that, and they're making an informed choice. So this whole idea of testing is really just a mechanism and an opportunity to, in their brain, switch their thinking, right? We talk about these short interventions. They are short interventions, right? They are an opportunity for individuals to think about the choices that they're going to make right before they're going to make them. And festivals are a really good opportunity to be able to have a captured cohort who, you know, are going to potentially have access to these drugs. So that's why not? To me, it's a no-brainer around testing these kinds of things.
Fiona, we've heard calls for the New South Wales government to trial pill testing ahead of that planned drugs summit so that authorities can really, I guess, assess the impact. Does it make sense to run a small trial so that the government can get the detail and the facts of that and have that at the table to consider?
I think we've got small trials in the ACT already, haven't we?
That's right, and Queensland.
Yeah, exactly. Look, I agree with everything you had to say. And look, I think, though, the one thing I would say, look, I think pill testing is important, particularly in these festivals, because it's 100% right. Once kids are, got through the sniffer dogs, they're obviously committed to taking them. But I think there's also an important narrative that pill testing is not a silver bullet, and it is not going to be it's not going to be the fix-all for this situation, because just because you test one pill doesn't mean another pill is perfect, and it doesn't stop overuse of pills. But I think there's also a whole range of education that needs to be provided to this. It's, yes, get tested what you can, understand the risks of what you're going to take. The pill testing is not going to test whether something was created in an unhygienic lab. But it's also, don't charge kids, 3 kidneys and an arm to get water. I mean, if you're going to be dancing all day, hydration, particularly in the summer we have ahead of us, these sorts of pills also do have a dehydration effect to them. So there is also a responsibility of festival operators to provide the appropriate medical support, to provide water readily available, not at some stupid cost. And I think when we look at these 2 young men that have lost their lives, very sadly, it's not just about pill testing. I think there's a whole suite of measures, to your point, Semara, around getting all of the pieces right. And I think when you sit here and just demonise one piece or think one piece is going to be a silver bullet, then it's being set up to then fail.
Well, but is this one piece of the puzzle? I mean, it sounds like you're saying that pill testing should happen.
I think it is one piece of the puzzle, and I think we're dumb for not doing it, would be my piece. But secondly, I don't think it can work in isolation.
So what are the other levers that you're really touching on there?
Additional medical support.
At festivals?
Yep. Additional education where possible. And, making sure water and things like that are readily available, even if you're in the front row. Even if you're in the front row and you're there all day dancing away, that you can get access to water.
Really about having a number of different mechanisms.
Absolutely. But if we sit there and say pill testing is going to fix this problem, then we're setting pill testing up to also fail, and we're proving those politicians correct.
Well, I think it's a really interesting point, because the politics, Sam, is extraordinary on this topic, isn't it?
It takes a very, very brave politician to sell the concept of pill testing to suburban seats as well as regional seats that have been absolutely torn apart, particularly by something like ICE. And it's a very hard political sell to say, yes, we're going to offer this service for pill testing. This is not a green light, but there are some people in seats that would see that as, sanctioning of taking pills. And in New South Wales as well has had a long-running and exhaustive inquiry into drugs in the state, And it got to the end of it, this was into ICE, and it got to the end of it, and it got very close to suggesting a decriminalisation of ICE. Now, inside the Coalition Party room, that was never, ever, ever going to pass at all, which is why we've got this drug summit coming up. So we can see that even in New South Wales, where there's the political will to do something, and there really is an appetite for serious drug reform and harm reduction, but actually putting that into place in terms of policy is much, much harder.
And risky for like, because of the point you made at the start, that it's a brave politician.
It's incredibly. But I also think that when we've got trials going on in the ACT, we've got trials going on in Queensland, and I think one of the most heartening facts that we're seeing in the ACT is that a lot of the pills that are getting tested, which are found to have toxic substances in them, festival goers are binning them. Sure, there's a minority, presumably, that they're going to do what they want, but that's the same with pharmaceuticals that you have in your cupboard. Yeah. And of course, the naysayers are also going to say there's no safeguard against taking too many of them. Again, you can say the same for pills in the cupboard. But what these takeaways from Queensland and Canberra are showing is that there is merit. And again, in a suite of initiatives, we should seriously be considering this.
But I think into the suite of initiatives, it's also about how these things are also managed in community.
Yep.
I mean, when you look at, say, back in the day, I mean, I did a drug summit when I was the member for Lindsay, and if somebody was intoxicated, they might get locked up in the cop shop and they get to sleep it off. Whereas if someone's done, quite a lot of ice and they've been awake for 3 or 4 days, they get taken to, say, a drug and alcohol facility within a hospital. They might sleep for 3 or 4 days, but they only get 7 days acute care, which means they've already slept through half of the care that they will need. So I think when we talk about drugs and the different levels of what you're dealing with and how you're dealing with them, I think there's a whole range of support services that are completely out of date and are not dealing with the actual drugs that are there. And when we're talking about pill testing, it's one of those things that are saying, well, maybe this has been cut with too much rat sack, or maybe this has been cut with something else, or cut with whatever. How is that going to interact with different things? And this is about saving lives, it's about education. And if young people realise they're not just taking something that's going to make them fun for the music festival, there's a whole range of other things in there that could really, damage them, their health, or dare I say, even kill them.
That's an interesting point around the kind of support services being more fit for purpose. But there was a point there that you were both making, Fiona and Sam, Ian, that is around what's found. So there was an Australian review that found when results didn't align with what was expected to be in the drug, 61% of people who tested it said they wouldn't take it. This tells a really interesting story, doesn't it, about knowing what is in what you have.
That's right. And also, pill testing isn't happening in isolation, right? What's also happening is that young person or person is having a conversation with a professional. Advice against taking drugs is not mutually exclusive with pill testing. These things happen at the same time. Conversations take place which wouldn't otherwise have taken place. So you're not only finding out what's in the drugs, you're also having a conversation you might not have had about the downside of doing precisely what you're planning to do. And look, the only other point I'd make, Dan, just quickly, is that on the question of political courage, as we heard in the intro there, I actually think that the electorate, the constituency out there, is indeed ahead of politics on this. And it might be brave for a politician to stick their head up above the political parapet in the parliamentary context. But I'm not sure it's so brave with the broader electorate. I actually think that most people see the sense of this.
That is a really interesting point, Sam, because often we see on really big issues there is a whole range of views in the community, and politicians don't take steps because there is often a fear of what the reaction might be. As Ian is alluding to there, actually the community might already be there or further along the way than the pollies.
I would not be surprised if the community is there already. I think all of us are in agreement that this is something that we should definitely be at least trialling. I think there's two factors. There's party room politics, and so now you've got Labor with a decent majority. I think that if the Minns government was to take a particular stand on pill testing, they're going to have the support of the Greens. I think it's reasonably easy within Parliament, and I think that if Chris Minns wants to stake his reputation as a conviction politician, and this is an issue that he's exercised about. I think that he should be able to wear that. Coalition party room politics, I think it's a bit more of a vexed issue, particularly because you do have such a regional drug issue, which is very different from what we're seeing in the city. And I think that the conversation becomes there. Why would we allocate, so much cash or put so much focus on one area of illicit drugs, which is pills, when we know that we've got a serious issue with other illicit drugs in the country that still we've known about for a very long time and still aren't being supported and mitigated in the way that regional communities have been crying out for. So I think that becomes the question of whether it's an allocation of resources, and I know it shouldn't be one, not the other, but it will be. That's something that needs to be navigated.
Ian, were you trying to jump in on that point as well?
I was just going to say, and it doesn't mean that you have to pull back on the hard-edged law enforcement approach that's required when it comes to the trade and supply of these drugs. These things all go together. They're not mutually exclusive. That's the only point I'd make.
Taking a very economic point of view on it, I mean, let's face it, drugs are about supply and demand. Yep. It's one point to get the supply off the streets as best you can, but it's also about how do you minimise the demand for these things and how do you educate about that. And if you just sit there and just demonise one part of the argument, you're not actually going to end the other side of it. And it doesn't matter whenever governments have tried this thing, whether it was prohibition in the United States, whether it was anything that's been tried to be banned in the past, it always finds a way through. So you've got to deal with both sides of this equation. And I think sadly too long we've sat on the law enforcement side and not necessarily looked at what's happened at the other end. And I loved the point you raised about regional communities, because what's going on there is a whole different kettle of fish. And again,
and different community to community.
100%. It's about what are the support services to help the individuals. And you know what? Our medical services, everything's just, they're not up to speed with where the community is.
Well, there might have been a universal truth there about conversations rather than demonising, which is a perfect segue to the Voice referendum now. And as early polling begins in parts of the country today, both sides are raising concerns about threats of violence in this final fortnight of campaigning. The Prime Minister hit out today at what he called a, quote, great big fear campaign from the no side, and he condemned comments on social media last week from boxer Anthony Mundine, who said he wanted to, quote, beat up prominent Yes supporter Thomas Mayo.
People have noticed the positive nature of the Yes campaign compared with some of the negativity that is there in the No campaign. I was quite shocked by Anthony Mundine's comments, for example, about fighting someone in the Yes campaign, and the fact that Warren Mundine thought that that was okay to back in those comments. What we actually need is to come together.
Warren Mundine, a second cousin to Anthony, amplified those comments on Facebook, declaring, quote, I want to see that when it came to that call for a fight. The No side says it's also worried about violence, with the Advance Australia group writing to the Electoral Commission warning of threats to its supporters.
The vitriol and hostility directed at our volunteers has been deeply unsettling. Many of our volunteers have conveyed apprehensions about participating in the democratic process of pre-poll and election day campaigning, fearing potential confrontations with hostile individuals or groups of individuals.
Semara, I want to start with you. You and I have touched on this before about the tone of the debate. What are you seeing and hearing?
Look, the things that we're seeing and hearing is often just about the volume of misinformation. You know, we're not coming to to this debate with facts. We're not actually focusing on the actual amendment and the question that is actually going to be posed on referendum day. You know, so we're getting bombarded with everything else and every other conversation around this, around anything to do with Aboriginal and Torres Strait people, that has actually got nothing to do with the actual question. And that, for me, is the part that it feels disingenuous. It feels like we're not having we don't have the ability to have the conversation about that. And we're just polarised. We're just completely polarised.
I've got a theory about this, because I reckon, as I've been travelling around, one of the things I'm hearing from lots of different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is that this is a chance where the focus is actually on the communities, and so all these conversations are bubbling up. That's on one hand. On the other hand, has been the real nastiness and the name calling, and some that have told me that they're bowing out because they feel like their livelihood and their identity is up for discussion and debate. This is also the first time that we've seen news bulletins across the board focusing on Indigenous affairs. There's a real complexity and layering here, isn't there?
There really is. You know, we've been often fighting to have our voices heard historically. It's overwhelming sometimes to have so much of a spotlight on us and our people. Our identity is being called into question so much more so. So that sense of resilience and the need to be resilient, the need to be able to, you know, be prepared to walk into spaces and deal with even more so the, you know, some of the comments and the things that we read on social media that aren't, you know, very nice, but it's confounded because of the mistruths, you know, and because of all of these other conversations. So, you know, we're doing what we can as, you know, First Nations allies and our supporters have been very positive and very, I think, really gracious. Especially with myself, I've had the opportunity to work with a few of our allies who have been out there advocating and campaigning for a yes, and I'm really humbled by it. It's this really kind of sense of you've taken an opportunity to listen and to hear and to carry on what I believe in and what I think will be able to address some of those systemic barriers. You know, this notion of we need a voice, you know, as pure and simple as that.
Fiona, Advance Australia, which is leading the No campaign, says that the vitriol and the hostility that's been directed at their volunteers has been really confronting, really unsettling. I wonder what your reaction to that is.
I think there's been vitriol on both sides. It's been unhelpful. I mean, the sharing of Jacinta Price's phone number on Twitter and the vile messages that was left for her, the death threats that she's received. I mean, she's an independent woman. She can make any opinion she likes, and I don't think that is right. Likewise, I don't think Anthony Mundine trying to pick a fight on it, I don't think that's right either. I mean, I think there's been vitriol on both sides that I think is harmful. And, you know, we all want a free, open, egalitarian society where we can agree and disagree with each other and we can debate matters out, and difficult matters, you know. And, you know, our nation's heritage and history and injustices that have happened to lots of different peoples, whether it's our First Nations people, the convicts that came to Australia, people who came to Australia from other countries, often escaping war and persecutions themselves. You know, there's a lot to be said in our nation's history, and I just find it devastating and terrible to see our nation ripping ourselves apart, and this sort of vitriol. I don't think it's our finest hour, and I think we can all do better, and I think both sides have a lot to be said with how they've, you know, attacked each other.
We've also heard comments from prominent No campaigners saying that essentially that the Prime Minister has unleashed this torrent, really, of so much abuse and vitriol. Is that fair?
We've also heard from Yes campaigners that have called Australians racist. So, I mean, I don't think that's fair either. My comment I would make at the Prime Minister...
I just want to hold up there, because you're not talking about Marcia Langton there, who said it was the No campaign rather than no voters.
But the way that has been interpreted by people has been in that...
Because it was misreported. Because
yeah. Well, I mean, Linda Burney made similar comments, and that has been taken...
About the campaign rather than the...
Yeah, but that's not the way it's been interpreted, and that's not the way it's been received.
But, I mean, part of that then is about the media reporting, isn't it? And it's about how, like those comments that Marcia Langton, she said specifically that was the No campaign, not the No voters, but the headline that was...
But is she calling Jacinta Price racist then?
Well, I think what she was saying is that underpinning that, the points that are made, there for some of those, when it was specifically about compensation and reparations, which Professor Langton said, look, that is only the decision of a court.
Yeah.
But that was something that she said is being peddled by some in the No campaign. And so she said, if you unpick that, that's really looking at the racism and or the stupidity was the term that she used.
And the way that has been reported and the way that has been received has not helped, you know, the Yes campaign, and it's been received in a different way, and media, you're 100% right, have said the way that has been received. But the challenge that we've got here is that these two pieces haven't brought each other together properly. Regarding the Prime Minister, to your first question, I mean, in my opinion, I think the Prime Minister has run at this too fast because he has wanted to have his own political agenda as opposed to the best outcome for the nation. We already know that through the Uluru Statement of the Heart, this is a process. There will be truth-telling and treaties and potentially sovereignty after that. We also know that a republic question...
So there was nothing in the Uluru Statement about sovereignty, so it was voice, treaty and truth.
In the pages that were after it are there, but yes.
But those 20, that's about the 26 pages, that was all about basically the notes of it. The Uluru Statement is one page, 440
But we do
words.
know that truth and treaty will follow. We also know that the Prime Minister has said he would also like to see the Republic question put up as well.
Completely separately.
So we know that we are on a journey here. This is not the end of the road. There are more pieces to go. I think what he should have done would have been recognition whilst he legislated the voice. We then do an audit of all the different Indigenous First Nations legislation across the states and clean some of that stuff up. There's inconsistencies, for instance, within the Native Title Act between each of the states. That could have been tidied up by a legislated voice. Second term, he could have then, if that was working well, he could have then, put that into the Constitution, and then we go on yes, truth-telling, treaty, republic, and all of those things. I think because he was wanting this so fast, he's run at it too quickly. Equally, I'm going to be fair here, I don't think Peter Dutton was correct in tying the Liberal Party room. The Liberal Party room has a tradition of not tying the party room because you are free to cross the floor. If we look at the marriage equality vote, there were people who were on the Yes campaign, people on the No campaign. If we look at the previous Republic debate, you had Tony Abbott on the No campaign, he likes to be on the No side, and you had Malcolm Turnbull on the Yes side. So I don't think it was correct for the Liberal Party to have been tied down either. I think there are people within the Liberal Party that are in the yes, there are people on the no, there are people that sit somewhere in the middle, and they're not in the middle because they've been told to by some talking point. And I think that's where I think both of the political leaders have been a party to some of the issues we have that has hindered the ability to have this free and open debate, that has had media outlets and different people picking sides, which means we end up with what has been, and I don't think it has been our finest hour. In fact, I think it's been really sad the way this debate has transgressed over the last, few months.
Semara, I think you were trying to jump in there. Was there something you wanted to add as well?
Look, I think to Fiona's point, it was very much about, media playing a very polarising role in terms of stressing particular arguments, yes and no, and I guess finding the conflict in this process. I think the point that is really key and fundamental in this process is that, yes, we're seeing this play out at a political level and a level that's, I would not normally even be in, but at a community level and at a grassroots level, we're seeing our community have mostly genuine conversations. They're mostly prepared to have respectful conversations at face to face, and are taking the opportunity to take and learn information. They want that, but what they're getting up here is stuff that is completely out of the way, and so I think that what our politicians are forgetting is what's happening on the ground. They're forgetting the people's movement. This is and has always been a people's movement. So the work that we do, is being about door knocking and having conversations, rocking up at our market stalls and having things, doing phone banking. Like, there are thousands and thousands of volunteers that are on the ground that are challenging what this argument that's, people are just throwing guna up and, you know, at each other. And that's not what this process should be about, you know. And so I'm disheartened with what's happening, and it feels disingenuous what's happening up in these big political spaces and what's happening in, you know, in the media. But I'm really humbled by what's happening on the ground. I'm really humbled by those multicultural communities who are coming out and are providing their support based on their own experiences. They're leveraging their own experiences around not having voices in their own countries and in their own communities, and really kind of showing that they understand and respect what that means for First Nations peoples here on the ground. So there are multiple views and multiple, I think, really different perspectives and conversations and yarns that have been really humbling and purposeful here. And it's disheartening that there is this disconnect from the politicians and from the, you know, the shit fighting and the throwing of guna. But you got to do what you got to do. You know, we always say this was always going to be a people's movement. It was always meant to be that. It was this why the Uluru Statement came from First Nations mob. It came and it was issued to Australians. Like, that's what we did, and we've followed that process. We need this process to continue, and we need to, in these last 2 weeks, continue to keep having more conversations and coming back to the fact of what this is about. Not about what the fight is and the, you know, the political football that they've turned this into. Come back to what is the referendum about? What is it asking? What is the amendment? You know? And it's purely like that's the thing that we've stopped having the conversations on. Come back to that. Otherwise, you know.
What do you say when
the mob on the ground are having it?
What do you say when people ask you that question of what is it about to you?
Pure and simple, we come back to what is the amendment, right? The amendment says it's about first and foremost recognition. We've had this conversation many, many times about how do we recognise First Nations peoples in the Constitution. Fiona agreed, we should recognise First Nations peoples. But what the Uluru Statement of the Heart did was it talked about, well, how do we do that recognition piece? And it clearly outlines it in those 3 points in the amendment. One, that we will establish a body called the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Voice. 2, that it has the ability to make representations to Parliament and the executive government. And 3, that Parliament will do its job and it will determine what the powers and the functions will be. It's pure and simple as that. Like, the fact that we as an organisation, and me as a young person growing up in our Cairns local community, having ideas about how do we address the problems that we have in our community, but never feeling like I was heard, never feeling like we have a space to be able to share our ideas with that are specifically about First Nations mob, and it go nowhere. Like, that's the thing, that's the frustration I have always felt. There are so many amazing young mob and First Nations people who have great ideas around how do we address and solve the issues that are happening on the ground because of our lived experience, because of our understanding of our families and our communities. That being able to take that advice, their knowledge, and being able to turn that into laws and policies, that's what we're asking for.
Fiona, what does it mean to you? What we're debating, the big national conversation, if you take out the noise, the throwing stuff around that Semara was talking about?
Look, I firstly think there is a place for the voice. For me, I think it does sit in legislation. I think there's a lot of work to be done across First Nations legislation everywhere so that it is fair and even and equal. I fundamentally don't like the idea of any race being in our constitution. I think it should be...
Although race is already in...
I agree, and I think that, what's it, Section 51?
There's two sections.
Yeah. And I think there's amendments that need to be there. I do think recognition is very important because our constitution was also an act of the British Parliament that brought together British colonies and also had a very wrong caveat in there around terra nullius, which was completely incorrect and did not bring Aboriginal people in and First Nations people in at the get-go. So I think recognition is a fatal flaw in our constitution when it brought together the British colonies, because it did omit Aboriginal people who were clearly here. So I think that has to be rectified. And I think it's devastating if this all goes down, because that piece is really, really important. But I think there is an important place for a voice. I think that needs to happen, and I think that needs to be in legislation. I think there's also, for me, when I look at Aboriginal people in my own community, particularly the Darug people, I want to see them get a voice too. Colonisation impacted them very badly. And, so I think there's a lot of questions here, and I just feel really sad that this has been run out too fast. And, if it had been staged out and people had gotten used to voting yes the first time, then we could have taken the nation on a journey with us. And I just don't feel we've taken the country on a journey with us. And I just think that's an opportunity lost.
Well, it's all of these matters that people will be weighing up right now, because pre-polling centres for the referendum are opening across the country this week. Today, voters in the Northern Territory, Tasmania, Victoria and Western Australia can vote in person, with early voting centres opening in the remaining states and territories tomorrow. The Australian Electoral Commission has already started receiving postal votes, and as Digital Engagement Director Evan Eakin-Smith told The Drum, they're going to great lengths to ensure all Australians can have a say.
If everyone can turn up on 14th of October, well, brilliant. That's what you should do. But around the country today, there are some early voting centres opening. Where it's a public holiday, they don't open until tomorrow, but there's a number of states and territories where there's early voting centres opening up. So that service is available for people. We've also had remote mobile polling conducted throughout the past week or so. That continues on. We've been seeing pictures from all around the nation, of course, very spectacular images of our staff going to great lengths, using helicopters, boats and barges, sometimes in the Torres Strait, flying hundreds of kilometres to the eastern border in Western Australia. It's a significant exercise. It's more than we've ever done before. We're communicating more than we've ever done before as well about those services. So we're really hopeful that residents in remote communities are getting good access to the vote, understand when we're coming, how long we'll be there, and making sure they get out, turn up and cast their vote. We've had about 1.5 million postal vote applications at this stage. If you look at previous federal elections recently, the trend for early voting has been going up and up. In fact, in 2022, just last year, if you combine postal voting and the people who turned up to early voting centres, it accounted for about half of the overall votes. So we'd be expecting probably about the same, about half of the population to turn up on referendum day itself, hopefully get themselves a democracy sausage or something from the cake store, and the other half will do it early. The AEC still has opportunities for employment. It's temporary employment, but it is a paid gig. So if you're interested, and particularly if you live in a regional area, there's still a good likelihood that you'll be able to get employed, particularly for referendum day, earn a few $100s, contribute to what is a pretty unique exercise, and be involved in the first referendum in 24 years.
Ian, you've seen elections roll out around the world as a diplomat. We often hear that the Australian Electoral Commission is world leading. What's your assessment of it and of the extraordinary amount of work that we're just hearing about?
I think it's an extraordinary organisation. I've seen it applying its skills in neighbouring Papua New Guinea, supporting elections there. But in the end, the Australian Electoral Commission is a group of Australian men and women who are seeking to support a proper process. And I think most of them are fairly typical of the Australian community. Back on our earlier conversation, these are people who actually believe in respectful dialogue, even if our politicians and some leading figures in social media don't. I think that we will see a process. And by the way, third space is a polling place on the day for the referendum. I think we'll see a process which where Australians do show that they are committed to a proper, respectful process. And God help us if we don't get it right beyond that point. We really need to come together after October the 14th.
Yeah, I think regardless of what happens on that day, there's going to be a lot of discussions about what it means and where to next. Samantha, in the final 2 weeks, I know you've been talking to campaigners and looking at kind of where they're going to be focusing on. What's the sense you're getting about campaign strategies?
So, I mean, the Yes campaign know that they've got a lot of ground to claw back in the final 2 weeks, and they're feeling quite optimistic that, you know, the 30% of the country that are undecided voters, that they'll be able to sway them as they get to the polling booth. So the one advantage that the Yes campaign does have is a lot more money than the No campaign, but also 50,000. They think that they've got about 50,000 volunteers who they can mobilise. They can get out there in the community, onto polling booths, and to have those one-on-one conversations that campaigners around the world have realised that that's the most effective way to persuade people and to change opinions. And when you've got a population of, 30% that is still undecided, there is a huge... there's a huge potential benefit.
It's quite extraordinary, isn't it?
It could be incredibly
like that
decisive.
volume of people that have not decided yet.
Exactly. And again, this goes to what Fiona was saying, that it's apparent that a lot of people feel like that they haven't been brought along on that journey, which is why what we see in the next 2 weeks is going to be so incredibly important. So also at the same time, we've got a new ad campaign that's coming out from the Yes campaign, which is focusing more on those tangible metrics like life expectancy, infant mortality rates that really separate the Indigenous population from the non-Indigenous population. And instead of saying vote yes, they're saying a no vote means no progress, and trying to point out the huge disparity between living standards between two populations. And they're thinking that perhaps that harder message, and because I think so far throughout the campaign we've seen a very optimistic message, maybe a loftier message that hasn't really connected with the population, particularly when they're struggling with cost of living, when they're struggling with housing affordability. But this is really focusing them on these hard metrics that concern all of us, that come out again and again in the Closing the Gap report. So I think we will start seeing a lot more just tougher advertising. I don't think it's going to go negative, but it will definitely be tougher.
And we've got about a minute left. Have we seen that type of campaigning before? Is there, as you've been talking to them, are you getting a sense that this is something that has been done or is working elsewhere?
It's very much a step change from what we've seen so far throughout the campaign. Yeah. We've seen in written literature and some of those materials that have been disseminated throughout the population. We've seen a lot of these hard stats and the metrics, but trying to package that up in sort of a bite-sized, consumer-ready, TV-appropriate package is very different. It's not as rousing and stirring as Johnny Farnham singing "You're the Voice," but actually this is what we're trying to change. We're trying to bridge a gap between living standards between two populations living in the same country, and I think that's the message. Now's the time for action.
Yeah, so we're going to see a lot of focus on both the campaigns this week, but more so next week in that final stretch. That is all, though, we have time for now. Thanks so much to our panel, Samantha, Hutchinson, Fiona, Scott, Ian Kemish and Semara Joe. It's great to have you all along. I'll be back with you tomorrow night. Until then, have an excellent evening. Good night.